You look at the West and you think we are living the dream. But let me show you the truth with numbers. In Europe, the richest 10% own about 60% of everything.
So if you're someone here today who thinks that Africa will never catch up with the rest of the world, I want to say that you will be proved wrong.
Africa is the only reason why Western Europeans get to enjoy such a high quality of life, especially for France. They brag about being able to live well even though they don't have to work as hard as Americans, but they omit the fact that all that comfort they enjoy comes off of the back of African resources and labor.
Africa has been kept poor deliberately for hundreds of years. And let me tell you what's going to happen. In the next 100 years,
Africa's economic rise is no longer a distant dream. It's happening right now. From vast natural resources to major infrastructure developments, the continent has continued to grow at a remarkable pace. In today's video, we take a look at what people around the world are saying about Africa's economic progress and its growing position on the global stage. We'll explore real reactions from different regions and hear what the world thinks about Africa's transformation. We begin with a powerful reaction from someone who speaks with deep passion and emotion about global inequality. He strongly disagrees with how the world's resources are unevenly distributed, pointing out that while some regions flourish, others are left drowning in debt. His message sets the tone for an important conversation about fairness, access, and Africa's rightful place in the global economy.
You look at the West and you think we are living the dream. But let me show you the truth with numbers. In Europe, the richest 10% own about 60% of everything. In the United States, the top 1% alone hold almost a third of all wealth. And the bottom half together, they own just 2%. Now look at Africa. The richest 1%, just 1 in 100, own about half of everything. In South Africa, the top 10% control more than 80% of the country's wealth. Do you see the pattern so far? It's not you against us. It's all of us beneath the same pyramid. Yes, there are differences. Here in the West, poverty is hidden behind clean streets and credit cards. People live in houses that belong to the banks, drive cars that belong to finance companies, and buy food on debt. I know it looks like comfort. It isn't, and it's actually control. In Africa, inequality is even more visible. The mansions of the few stand out against the struggles of the many. But the design is the same. A tiny elite holding everything while the majority carry the weight. We are actually more alike than you think. You are told that we are rich, but most of us are drowning in debt, stress, poison, food, and illusions. And we are told you are poor, but your lands are rich, your spirit is strong, and still the same sharks feed on you. So let's be clear. The problem is not that Africans lack or that Westerners have. The problem is that everywhere, the wealth of nations is captured by the few, while the many are told stories to keep them divided. So, you think we are your enemy? We were told you are ours. But the truth is actually simpler than that. We are all being lied to. And as long as we believe the lie, the pyramid stands.
Next, we hear from a young and bright mind who speaks with confidence about Africa's future. He says Africa is the fastest growing economy in the world, and with its large population, abundant natural resources, and massive potential, the continent is on track to become a global superpower. His optimism reflects a new generation that believes Africa is not just rising, it's leading.
And unlike many countries in the West, including Britain, Africa is not saddled with debt. The British debt is 87% of the British GDP, while the African debt is only 9% of their GDP. All but 2 countries in Africa could pay off their debt within 1 year. So the potential is already there, and the growth is already beginning. Even now, Africa is the continent in the world with the fastest economic growth. The GDP per capita of sub-Saharan Africa is expected to rise by 800% from 2020 to 2050. Anyone who doubts that Africa can make quick economic progress like this should look at the economic history of the US. In 1977, the US economy was the same size as the African economy is today. And since then, the American economy has grown by a massive $18.419 trillion. And with Africa having more natural resources than the US, its progress in the next 40 years could be even more spectacular. So if you're someone here today who thinks that Africa will never catch up with the rest of the world, I want to say that you will be proved wrong. With its mammoth population, massive potential, and amazing stores of resources, within your lifetime, Africa will become an economic superpower. Thank you.
The next person reflects on Africa's past and the long-lasting effects of exploitation during the colonial era. He points out that despite being rich in resources, Africa never truly benefited from its former colonizers. However, he notes that China is now stepping in to bridge that gap by investing heavily in infrastructure, from roads and bridges to major development projects across the continent.
Africa is the only reason why Western Europeans get to enjoy such a high quality of life, especially for France. They brag about being able to live well even though they don't have to work as hard as Americans, but they omit the fact that all that comfort they enjoy comes off of the back of African resources and labor. England, Portugal, Germany, Belgium, Italy, and France all made a massive scramble for Africa in the 1880s, and France by far still has their foot in their old colonial ways. Even though these African nations have declared their independence, France and a couple other countries are still exploiting them, and they have given nothing in return to these African nations. They have built very little in infrastructure and construction. They have given next to nothing compared to how much they have taken to support their ways. Out of the 8 African coups that have happened since 2020, 7 of them were from French colonies. The French do not know how to build, they do not know how to innovate, they do not know how to grow democracy in any part of the world, which is why for the past 60, 70 years, they have just had French puppets that were ruling these African countries that finally got sick of how they were being treated. China has only taken an interest in Africa for 30 or 40 years, yet they have built more industry and infrastructure than all of the other European countries combined. So of course, the African nations are going to have a much more favorable disposition towards China since they are the ones who are actually building factories, roads, bridges, hospitals. China is actually divesting a lot of their own resources to make this possible. And you guys know how I feel about a lot of Chinese policy, but they did hit the nail on the mark when it comes to Africa.
Up next is a passionate Pan-Africanist who speaks with conviction about the continent's independence and dignity. He insists that Africa must have its own voice on the global stage and strongly condemns the outdated systems and policies that have kept the continent economically suppressed. His message is clear. Africa can no longer be spoken for. It must speak for itself.
Africa has been kept poor deliberately for hundreds of years. And let me tell you what's going to happen. In the next 100 years, for the First and Second World War, the battlegrounds of capitalism and communism was Europe. The battleground of modern politics will be Africa. The West and the East will come here and they will compete here to have a say in what happens to Africa. And I'm totally against that. Africa needs to be its own voice, and that's why I'm a Pan-Africanist, and I won't sympathize to the left, to the East, and I won't sympathize to the West.
The next person highlights Africa's demographic and economic momentum. He points out that the continent not only has one of the fastest growing populations in the world, but also one of the fastest growing economies, a combination that positions Africa as a major force in the future global landscape.
I'm going to redefine the term industry, Africa. Here's the story. Follow me on this. 9 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world are going to be in Africa in 2025. Everybody's overlooking it. Only 0.5% of the world's private equity and venture capital is going into Africa, despite the fact that it's going to be the only continent with a growing population. A marketplace is all about consumers and producers instead of people on the tail end of life that are draining money out of an economy. Africa has a vibrancy.
Here we hear another perspective focusing on Africa's large and youthful population. He expresses optimism about the continent's growing influence and is encouraged by the fact that Africa now has more options when it comes to international partnerships. With multiple countries seeking economic cooperation, Africa is in a stronger position to negotiate and benefit from global opportunities.
Media loves portraying Africa as a place that's hopelessly impoverished and always prone to conflict. And while there are certainly issues, I believe that Africa is the future. Let me explain. The first thing you have to understand is just how many Africans there are. 30 years ago, there was roughly as many people living in Europe as there was in Africa. But now there are now 3 times as many Africans compared to Europe. In 20 years, there will actually be 4 times as many. What this means economically is that the average African only needs an economic output that's 1/4 of that of a European in order for the African economy to be larger than Europe. And I think this is super impressive, especially given the disgusting role that Europe has played in Africa through colonization and empire, it's beautiful to see Africa having the potential to overtake Europe. The second thing you also need to understand is for a long time period, it was really just the Western countries that were able to dominate the world economically, politically, and through empire. But now in the last 20 years, we've seen the rise of many economies such as China, India, Russia, Turkey, etc. And what this means is all these countries are competing against each other. And if an African state doesn't like the West, they can just kick them out and bring in a different country in. And if they don't like that country, they can kick them out and bring another country in. So unsurprisingly, for instance, we're actually seeing a number of African countries that are, cutting off relations with European powers and even evicting their military. And because of this, you have to understand that the third factor I want to talk about is we're now at a point where a lot of the fastest growing countries economically in the world are in Africa. According to the most recent figures for this year, 6 of the fastest growing economies are now in that continent.
Next, we hear from someone who firmly believes that the future belongs to Africa. He mentions that global economic predictions consistently point to Africa as the fastest growing economy in the coming years. He also notes a major demographic shift. While birth rates are declining in many other parts of the world, Africa's population continues to rise. According to him, this combination of growth and youth will make Africa the most populous and economically influential region in the near future.
Future is African. By the end of this century, it is predicted that the only continent experiencing growth will be Africa. 13 of the 20 biggest cities in the world will be in Africa, and at least 1/3 of the global population will be African. There are a couple reasons for this. The first being, while that birth rates in the rest of the world are falling drastically, birth rates in most African countries are actually still quite high. Sub-Saharan Africa has one of the youngest populations in the world, with 70% of people under the age of 30. And having a young population brings a lot of opportunities for economic growth and innovation if those opportunities can be recognized and utilized. And it just so happens that Sub-Saharan Africa is the 3rd fastest growing crypto market in the world. The way that Africa will develop is through something known as the flying east paradigm. The reason that China was able to develop so rapidly was because the US was outsourcing all of their manufacturing jobs there. They used this increase in capital to reinvest in their development, and now China is one of the world's global superpowers who is outsourcing all of their manufacturing to African countries, like Ethiopia, who have already started their industrial parks development program.
This next person draws a striking comparison between the economic rise of certain West African countries and that of China. According to the data he references, their growth trends go hand in hand. He also emphasizes the key factors fueling Africa's rise: vast natural resources, a highly educated and emerging workforce, and major investments in long-term infrastructure. In his view, these elements are positioning Africa as a serious global contender.
West Africa may become the next great economic power zone sooner than we thought. I've been reading through the news, and I'm reading stories that make me question how long the global economic hierarchy can last. Did you know that many West African countries are growing faster than China did during the early 2000s? Let me use Ghana as my example. Here's the economic data on China, and here's the economic data on Ghana. Ghana is more wealthy today than China was in 2006, and I would argue that the GDP for Ghana is vastly underestimated by at least 30 to 40% because of the gray markets. But here's the biggest difference between West Africa and the other countries that grew rapidly in recent history. Ghana and other African nations are not powering their growth with individual debt. They are powered by access to raw resources, a rapidly growing educated population, value-added activities, and investments in long-term infrastructure.
Here again, we see another comparison between Africa's economic growth and China's rise. This person says that when he looks at Africa's current trajectory, he sees a path very similar to what China followed during its economic boom. In his view, the pace, potential, and transformation unfolding across the continent mirror the early stages of China's global ascent.
I want to leave one message, and that is that Africa's growth prospects for the next 40 years are extremely strong. Africa could achieve during the next 40-year period essentially what China achieved during the period from 1980 to 2020. And China went from being a low-income country to a high-income country in a period of just over 40 years. My view is that this is possible for Africa, and that this should be the aim.
And that brings us to the end of today's video. From powerful comparisons to China's rise to bold predictions about Africa's future, one thing is clear: the world is finally recognizing the continent's potential. From its natural resources and growing population to its expanding infrastructure and global partnerships, Africa is stepping into a new era of influence and opportunity. Thank you for watching and being part of this conversation. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Africa Info channel for more stories, reactions, and insights from across the continent and beyond. Until next time.